Hi, everyone. My name is Christina. I am from First Light Psychology Services, and I just wanted to welcome you to our webinar this evening about channeling emotions. I'm grateful to have you guys here tonight, and just to give you a little feedback about how it's going to run, I am going to go through a brief PowerPoint with some details. I'm not sure how this works for you guys, but I know for me, my personal learning style, I'm really much better when I have a visual and the lecture. So I hope that you guys find this helpful. So we'll go through some slides. I'm going to go through some information, and then towards the end, I'm going to leave an opportunity for some questions towards the end of the webinar. This way, it'll give you guys an opportunity to ask me anything that might have come up through the slides, or if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. So what I do recommend is, if you don't already, have some sort of writing utensil, pen, pencil, and some notepad, just in case we go through some stuff on these slides and you want to swing back to it in the question section, or you want me to sort of answer a question on something that we discussed a little earlier. This way you can jot it down, take some notes, and feel free to do so as we go through the presentation, okay? So I'm going to get started and start the presentation. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, you guys are here for the Channeling Emotions seminar. So just a quick reminder and welcome that this webinar is for informational purposes only. So if you do feel like after this webinar you need some more information, or maybe you're thinking about speaking to a professional for some treatment, please seek professional assistance through someone in the mental health, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, so any sort of licensed healthcare professional. And if you have questions or need some help with finding, the appropriate channel to get you a pathway to hook up with a provider, please feel free to email us. I will be providing our website with our contact information at the end of the slides, so that'll be available for you guys, okay? So just briefly, I want to talk about some loose goals that I want to talk during this webinar we're going to sort of address. So the first one, right, in order to channel emotions appropriately, it's really important that you understand your emotions and the purpose that they serve for you. A lot of people, will talk about this a little later on, like to say that they're stressed. Well, what does stress mean? Can you be more specific about what stress is for you? My clients who come into treatment with me, we talk about that a lot in the beginning sessions, and I talk to them about why we need to sort of expand on what stress means for you and how that could serve you better in the future in terms of how we're going to work through some better coping skills for them as they go through treatment. I'd like to talk about sort of improving your ability to manage emotions. So that coincides with the fourth goal here, is increasing your skillful approach to managing them, right? So by going through the process and understanding a little bit about emotions and what purposes they serve and how they function, that will hopefully go in tandem with increasing your skillful approaches as I provide you some skills on how to manage them, right? And the idea here is that all of these skills may not work 100% for you, but it's a tool belt, right? So just like if you were a construction worker and you needed a set of tools, you're not going to bring just a hammer, right? You're going to bring a whole toolkit. And then once you get to that job, you're going to figure out what tool in that toolkit is the best tool for that job. It's kind of the same concept with our emotions, right? We're going to develop a certain set of skills in our toolkit, in our emotional toolkit. And then hopefully as you practice these skills and as you go through in your life with different situations, you'll be able to understand which skill works for you in which situation and corresponds with certain emotions in an effective way. And we're also going to talk about we're going to briefly touch on some sort of emotional vulnerability. So what are some factors that make you emotionally vulnerable? Especially within the last year, there are lots of vulnerability factors I'm sure many of you have been going through or have been able to identify it as a result of sort of the stressors of the COVID-19 pandemic and how things have been impacting everyone in various realms of our lives. So we're going to get into that too, okay? So my first slide is the wheel of emotions. Now, some of you may have seen this in some shape or form. This is an example that I like to use because if we go back to sort of the statement that I talked about earlier, stressed, right? As you can see, if I said I came into treatment or I was talking to someone and I said, I'm feeling stressed, right? Where would stress fall on this wheel for you? Now, stress for me might be that I'm angry, right? Or stress for you might be that you're feeling sad or you're feeling bad or you're feeling surprised or fearful, right? If we look at that middle circle. So if my version of stress is different than your version of stress, then the skills that I use might not be as effective for you because your definition is different. So keep that in mind when we're talking about how to channel and manage your emotions more effectively. The idea here is the more specific that you can be with your emotion, that the goal would be for us is to get a skill that would be equally specific to that emotion so it's more effective. So as you can see, there's main skills in the middle, and as you go out further in the circle, it's getting more specific about what that particular thing is for you. So if you're feeling angry, that might be associated with some of the things in that lighter pink area, right? Let down, humiliated, bitter, mad. And then it could even be more specific in the dark pink area, betrayed, resentful, disrespectful, ridiculed, okay? So the first part of being able to channel emotions effectively is being able to properly identify them, okay? Because lots of people may feel this rush of emotion, but not be able to sort of weed through what it really is. So I wanted to present you guys with this example because I thought it was a really good visual to see how something could feel simple, like I feel sad, but actually be really specific and turn out to be you're really feeling abandoned or you're really feeling powerless, which would be a much different skill, and you would want to explore some triggers of that in a different way, okay? So let's talk about what emotions are. Now, we all know, going back to that wheel, at some point you guys have experienced a range of emotions. We experience a range of emotions on a daily basis, on an hourly basis sometimes, right? So emotions generally help drive our behaviors, okay? So when there's a trigger, there's an emotion that generally follows that, and that emotion generally helps drive some of our behavior. They help communicate our needs through thoughts, our needs and thoughts to others. So maybe our emotions, or maybe you're a more expressive person. So your body language, your facial expressions. Maybe if you're pissed off, people can really feel that in your face. Or if you're happy, you're someone who wears that on your sleeve, right? And they can see that you're beaming and you're smiling. So those help communicate our needs and our thoughts and how we're feeling to other people. And sometimes that could even have an influence on other individuals, even if we don't intend on it. So if we're having a really bad day and we're walking into work with that bad morning on our back, right? The way that we're expressing ourselves, those behaviors that are coming from those emotions might be influencing or impacting the others in our work environment, or maybe it's your home, right? Maybe they're feeling that anger. Maybe they're feeling that because you're angry, you might be a little snippy. So then maybe they're a little bit hesitant to engage with you. Maybe they feel like they're walking on eggshells around you because they don't really know what's going to make you mad and what's going to make you happy. So all those things, right, about how they communicate, think about it from all those perspectives. Because while we're the ones feeling that emotion has a spiderweb effect on these various things and who we're engaging with in our day, whether it's children, a spouse, work, like I said earlier, friends, any sort of engagement we have with others. Generally, if we are wearing our emotions on our sleeves, they're going to have some sort of influence, right? If you go into a social environment and you're coming in with a frown on your face and kind of mopey and standing in the corner, and that's your expression of feeling hurt, people are going to recognize that. People are going to pick up on that. Emotions also work to communicate to us. They help us process important information. So there's a connection somewhere along the line in our lives. We've connected a certain emotion to a certain thought or feeling or experience. So When those things engage with each other, your brain is processing how all those things work together. And that's motivating some of our behavior. And sometimes, which is really important, people, and this is just a human thing, we all do it in some shape or form, will mistake our emotions as actual facts. And I'm going to get into why that's so important in a little bit. But I want you to keep that concept in your head a little, right? Our emotions are not necessarily facts, and that's an important distinction, and we'll find out why in a few. So just a continuation, emotions can drive our thoughts, our actions, and behaviors, right? And this cycle can be both positive and negative. So our emotions can work in our favor. So say, for example, if I put my hand on a hot stove and I didn't have any emotions that were associated with that flame, I would keep my hand there and I wouldn't move it back because I wasn't able to process the fact that that was a harmful situation and I was in trouble, right? So that's a positive way in which our emotions impact us. Or say you were in a situation and you were crossing a street and a car was coming and you saw that if you didn't get out of the way and you didn't feel that scared feeling or that anxious feeling that you saw the car coming, you would have walked faster to avoid the car hitting you. So those are certain examples about how the emotion connects to the behavior that is a positive outcome. But they also are negative situations when our emotions can drive our thoughts, actions, or behaviors. A common one that many people, or it's easy for you guys to sort of have this visual, is when we come home for our day with something on our mind, and then we take all those emotions that have built up throughout the day and we project them on the people around us, whether that's a spouse, a child, a friend, a roommate, whoever that person is for you. It may not have anything to do with that individual, but because those emotions are so strong, it's coming out in some shape or form and has a negative impact on your relationship. Oh, I just recognized a typo, so sorry guys. But they also serve a purpose, right? So how would we act without emotions? What would be some consequences of no emotions? So how would you feel if you were unable to have empathy or connect with an individual in your life, or you're not able to experience joy, sadness, right? If you think about this in a very balanced sort of way, there's good and bad. So we experience, like that diagram showed you, that circle, a range of emotions. So think about that for a moment. How would it feel for us to have no expression or no availability to connect with those emotions? And what would be the consequence? What if you couldn't experience love? What if you couldn't experience joy? What if you couldn't experience hurt, right? There's growth that comes from negative emotions as well. We learn from those experiences. So think about that. The emotions may be hurtful in the moment when we experience challenging ones, but they also serve a purpose. Okay, and like I mentioned earlier, our brain assigns an emotion to our experiences. So over the course of our life, we've had certain experiences that have connected to an emotion. So whether it could be a smell, it could be a situation, it could be a song, right? Maybe you had a relationship with someone and there was a particular song that reminds you of them. So now 10, 15 years later, when you hear that song, you think thoughtfully of that individual. That's your brain assigning an emotion to an experience of that song, or the memory that connects you through that song to that individual. So let's talk briefly about what is the cycle of emotion. So this is an adaptation from dialectical behavior therapy, which is a mode to sort of work with individuals who need assistance in improving their skills with emotion regulation. So let's just go through the cycle and talk about these briefly, okay? So let's start at number 1. So we're at the bottom left-hand side on my screen, prompting event. So what does prompting event mean? That's really just a fancy way to say trigger, right? So something happens either around you, in your environment, or a thought or an action that sort of happened in your head. Maybe you smelt something that made you, maybe you had an aversion to a food and then you smell that food. And so now that's your prompting event and emotion, right? So whether that's inside within you or outside in your environment, something happens, okay? So that's step one. Now, if we go to the cycle and we go to 2, that prompting event or trigger happens, and now your brain and your body, based off your life experiences, interprets that. So your brain is now understanding that trigger in a certain way and trying to understand what has just happened and figure it out. Then we go to 3, which is your emotional experiencing. So your brain changes, your face and body changes, you're sensing an emotion coming on, and there's some sort of urge to act or to move into the next phase of number 4. So what do we mean by brain changes and face and body changes? That's sort of the build up to the expression that we were talking about earlier. So your body language, whether you start pacing because you're anxious, or you start sweating because you're worried. I know for me, when I have to give a public speech in front of live people, in front of individuals, I get nervous, I get blotchy, right? So that's my emotional expression of when I feel anxious in that situation. Maybe when you're mad, right? Your eyes are squinted, or you have a frown. Maybe it's the words that you're using or the expression of the words you're using, right? So the way we express the things that we're saying can also identify our emotion. If someone's happy, they're generally gonna have an upbeat tone, and they're going to use happy sort of language, versus when they're angry, they're probably going to have a lower tone, or maybe not speak, right? Be a bit monotonous and use words that would signify that they're not happy. And actions, right? Slamming a book on the table, slamming a door, throwing something on the floor, hugging someone. Those are all interpretations of emotional expressions. Okay, and then we're going to move to 5, which is the after effects. So after 1 through 4 has happened, you're going to have some after effects of maybe associating it to a memory or a thought, right? Or maybe it's impacted your physical functioning, like someone who may have a panic attack. So if any of you have experienced a panic attack, that can be a very scary thing. And so you physically feel drained, or you're having a response where your heart's racing, or you're sweating, or you feel like you're going to pass out. And behavior. So what's the product of this whole cycle? How did that play out, right? Did you get up and leave because you've had an argument with someone? Did you break up a relationship because you guys were not agreeing on something, right? And any secondary emotions that come with that. So maybe it started off as anger, but then it led to frustration, then it led to disappointment. So what are some of those secondary emotions? And now all of those things are going to lead, if you look at the bottom, in parentheses, we see vulnerabilities to react again. So because of those after effects, right? Or sometimes I say ripple effects, which if you guys have the visual of maybe dropping a pebble into a water, right? And you visualize the ripple effect of when that pebble hits the water, you have the circles around. So the ripple effect of in that number 5 area of all those after effects are now going to spread out. And those things make you vulnerable to continue the cycle and could potentially become triggers for you to restart the cycle all over again. Okay. So I know it's a lot of information about, how the emotional process works, but I wanted to give you guys sort of the simple cycle, because lots of times I hear when people come into treatment with me is that it just happened, right? Or they'll say, I don't know where it came from. So we talk about, like I said earlier, an important part of being able to manage and channel emotions effectively is being able to understand them, identify them, and understand how it works. So I wanted to give you this just to sort of give you guys a background of saying, hey, listen, look, it doesn't necessarily just come from nowhere, right? There is a cycle that happens. We may not be aware of it in the moment, but it does exist. So let's talk about some skills to improve management. Now, I'm going to talk about the opposite action skill first, which seems obvious and seems really simple to do, but is also incredibly difficult. Okay, so the opposite action skill sounds exactly the way it's intended. You're doing an opposite action. So what do I mean by opposite action? Now, I'm going to use an example of really simple emotions for illustrative purposes. So if someone's angry, there are going to be certain characteristics that people do, right? So if I'm angry, I may stamp my feet, I may raise my tone of voice, I may yell a little. So what the opposite action skill teaches us is, if we know how we act when we're angry, do the opposite. So if I'm angry and I know I tend to yell, I'm going to, when I recognize I'm angry, use a softer tone of voice and do the opposite of how I would normally act. Okay? If I'm sad, I may tend to isolate and not want to talk to anyone and stay to myself. So the opposite action skill in that situation would be to reach out to someone. Call a friend, call a family member, a support system. So you're doing the opposite of what you normally would do. If someone is struggling with addiction and they know that they turn to a substance, whether it could be happy if they're celebrating something, or it could be something negative if they're trying to mask that negative emotion, right? Do the opposite action skill. Go to a meeting. Call a sponsor. Something that would be the opposite of your usual action. Because what you're doing is you're retraining your brain to have a more positive impact and not allow the emotion drive the automatic behavior. Because you've already identified that some of those automatic behaviors might not be effective for you, right? So if you're feeling sad and you withdraw from friends, chances are that's not going to help you get out of that cycle of sadness or cycle of depression. That's going to actually increase those emotions for you because you're not challenging them, right? So you're sitting with that sadness in your room by yourself and you're left to those thoughts without challenging them. So the idea of the opposite action skill is that you're recognizing the emotion and you're taking an active step to do the opposite of what you would normally do. Okay? So again, just to illustrate, if you're angry and your normal go-to would be to fight or yell, you would do the opposite. You would talk nicely, use a softer voice, and communicate more effectively. Okay? And the idea here, like I said, is that you're retraining those thoughts. You're retraining those automatic behaviors to put yourself in a position where you're de-escalating the emotion. If you were angry and you were engaging in whatever, say you were angry with an individual at work. Now, if you're angry and you're talking at a heightened tone and you're talking aggressively, and then that person is talking aggressively back at you and you guys are going back and forth, that's not going to de-escalate that situation. That's going to escalate the situation and make that anger worse. If you apply the opposite action skill and you talk softly and you engage yourself in a different way, it might not work 100% of the time, but that person will be less likely to react off of your emotion, and then you'd be less likely to act off their emotion. And the hope is that that would de-escalate the situation. Okay? So let's talk about some vulnerability factors. So common vulnerability factors that can lead to poor skills to improve emotion regulation and channeling emotions effectively. Common ones I see: lack of sleep, poor diet, poor boundary setting. So what do I mean about boundary setting? Self-care, right? So we're pushing ourselves to a limit without proper self-care, without attending to our own needs, okay? Not being able to say no. That's another common one. So maybe along the lines of self-care, you're the type of individual that may not be able to say no to someone. So you've overextended yourself in many different areas and therefore can't really attend to any of those things 100%, or the way, maybe it's not 100%, but to the degree in which you're happy with them, right? So that makes you vulnerable for emotional reactivity. So think about, for you, what are some vulnerability factors, right? Not eating throughout the day, being, for some people that affects blood sugar. So if you're someone who is very reactive to blood sugar issues and you don't eat all day, and then suddenly you're like, why am I so cranky? Why am I feeling so sad? Why am I feeling like I have no energy? That's a vulnerability factor for you. So you can improve on that the next day and say, you know what? I know at 12 o'clock I need to get a snack, because my vulnerability factor for me to feel overwhelmed at the end of my workday is associated with the fact that I need a boost of energy and I need some sort of nourishment in the middle of my day. Okay. So think about what some vulnerability factors are for you. Because if you're able to identify vulnerability factors within you and you recognize them throughout your day, chances are you can counteract them and help with some of the management and channel those emotions in a much more effective way. So the third skill is called check the facts. Okay, so if you go back to a couple of slides before, I said sometimes we think that our emotions are facts. Now, when we go throughout our day, we talk to ourselves in our head, not in a psychosis sort of way, but our own sort of self-talk that we do, whether it's psyching ourselves up or saying in our head or saying, wow, I could have done that better, whatever sort of internal dialogue we have within our head. When someone is ineffective at channeling emotions, overall, that person is likely misinterpreting their emotion as a fact. So if you have someone, let's talk about, like, if you guys have ever heard of the concept of catastrophizing. So that's the person who might say, oh my God, I have a paper cut. My finger's going to get infected. My hand's going to get infected. My whole arm's going to get infected. They're going to have to amputate. Versus the person who's going to say, wow, I have a paper cut. Let me put some Neosporin on it and a Band-Aid and it'll heal. So if you're the person who would engage more in the catastrophizing realm, what you're doing is you're allowing that internal monologue that you're having in your head and you're to progressively increase the emotion because you're not challenging the facts in that situation, right? Is it true that if you have a paper cut that your hand is going to get infected and you'd have to be amputated? Now, I guess there is an off chance and a possibility, because I don't like to say 100% to anything, that could happen. But what are the chances that that's realistic in your situation? The chances are probably low, right? So if you challenge that thought from the onset and say, wait a second here, it's just a paper cut. I could put some antibiotic Neosporin on it and wrap it. Chances are it's not going to go any further than just a paper cut. So by checking the facts, I've sort of cut off that over emotional reaction and channeled it into a thought process that's now more effective for me. That is not going to continue to go through that cycle of catastrophizing, which likely will lead to anxiety because I've misinterpreted my emotion of anxiety as a fact. I'm challenging it and I'm saying, okay, what's the reality of this situation? So some questions you could ask yourself in order to check the facts is, what triggered the emotion? So I have the paper cut. What assumptions or interpretations that I'm making? Well, I'm catastrophizing that a paper cut's going to get infected and turn my hand into an infection, turn my arm into infection, and then I'm going to need to get amputated. And you could ask yourself, well, does that intensity of the way I'm thinking about the situation and the way my emotions are matching the situation, does that match the facts of what's actually happening? And if you answer no to that question, then that's a sign that you probably need to use a skill to channel the emotion in a much more effective way. Okay, so check the facts. It's a really good skill that you can use. And I'm trying to give you guys skills that you can do in any area. Right? Sometimes in therapy, there are skills that clients have to use in certain situations that you might not be able to do, like sitting at your desk or sitting at home, or maybe you have a family and you can't take that, 20 minutes to do a meditation strategy right there. So you need something just that you can sort of do in the moment in your head to just settle yourself, reframe, and channel the emotion into a place that you could actually use it and move forward from it, right? A lot of emotion channeling and emotion regulation is a balance. It's a balancing act, right? You don't want to disengage and not recognize your emotion, but you also don't want to let that emotion take over. So you want that balance of being able to say, okay, well, this is making me anxious. I understand my anxiety and where it's coming from, but you know what? I have the skills to manage it, so it's not going to sit with me and ruin my day. So remember, we're looking for that balance, and by checking the facts, you're getting that balance, right? You're saying, okay, I'm in an emotional state right now. I'm going to check my facts with my rational thinking and my mind and what the facts are, and I'm going to come to a compromise in the middle. So that's what this is kind of getting you to do when I say the check the facts skill. So continue with some skills to improve management. Let's talk about the please skill. So if you look in the way I wrote this, it's kind of hard to see for the PL, but the PL is actually in physical, right? So the P and the L. I tried to capitalize them a little for you so you can figure out which ones were actually standing for please. But these are some basic self-care strategies that can be extremely helpful when you need to channel your emotions in an effective way. So right off the top, let's talk about physical illness. So you're going to treat any illness you have. How many times have we pushed ourselves? Oh, I have a headache. It's fine. It's fine. Let me drink some water. Let me drink some water. It's not really going away. Let me eat a snack. Let me do this. And as that strategy continues and you're sort of ignoring that vulnerability factor like we talked about earlier, that headache is getting worse. Maybe it's turning to a migraine, and your mood is going to follow. So your mood is going to progressively get worse and worse as your headache gets worse and worse. So rather than allowing that to continue and for your emotions to get worse and for your headache to get worse, take a moment, stop, and treat what's going on. Take a Tylenol. Take a break. Many of you guys have been working from home on your computers. Step away from your computer for a minute and just take a break and resettle yourself. So, maybe it is the water, maybe it is food, whatever you need to attend to. It's usually more effective for you to take that step back, treat whatever is going on, then push yourself past that boundary and allow it to get worse. Okay, so treat that physical illness, whether that's taking medication that you're prescribed, whether it's if you're diabetic and you know that your blood sugar may be dropping, that's definitely associated with mood. So take that minute to attend to what that need is for you. Okay. And piggybacking on the diabetes and the mood and the eating correctly, eating healthy. Okay, so if you eat healthy and listen, I'm a realist. I know that it's not always possible to eat healthy. Okay, I love my Doritos myself, and being home, I'm sure we've all shared. We may have been on really good diets, but some of that might have gone out the window. But you will be surprised how eating well can also impact your mood. Now, I'm not saying don't have a cheat day, or if you are, you want something, that's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it. But try and think about, is there a connection to what I'm putting in my body and how my mood is? Because sometimes there is. So again, remember, these skills aren't meant to be the be-all, end-all to solving these issues. They're just meant for you to have in that toolbox because they could be helpful, right? So if you're feeling exceptionally jittery, maybe take a step back and say, okay, how much sugar have I had today? That sort of a thing, right? Maybe step down on the sugar and maybe you'll be a little less jittery, a little less anxious, right? Or coffee. Coffee tends to be a trigger for people who suffer from anxiety. So if you're feeling exceptionally anxious that moment, and you're trying to channel your emotions effectively, having more coffee is not going to help. It's actually going to work against you. So think about it from that perspective. Okay, avoid using mood-altering substances, whether that's drugs, alcohol. It could be food like we talked about earlier. But whatever that substance is for you, be careful, because if you're emotionally vulnerable, right, and you're using some of these substances, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to channel them in an effective way, right? People who suffer from substance abuse or addiction, if they're angry about a situation and they turn to their substance, there can be instances in which that anger then escalates rather than numbs it. So then that's going to be an improper way to challenge that emotion of anger. You're using a poor coping skill. Okay, so be mindful of what sort of things you're, again, with the eating healthy as well, be mindful of things that you're putting into your body, because that can have a direct impact on how you're feeling and your ability, right? That's a vulnerability factor, like we talked about earlier, your ability to channel those emotions effectively. Sleep, really important. Okay, you can, believe it or not, sleep too much, just like you could sleep too little. So again, it's about balance. You want to make sure that you are getting adequate sleep. And listen, everyone has a different amount of sleep. Me personally, I need to sleep at least 8 hours. My husband can function on a little less, but that's our baseline, right? So know your baseline. If your baseline is 8 hours, but because of life circumstances, you're getting 4, that's now a vulnerability factor for you to be more emotional. So that would be a factor that could inhibit you from channeling emotions effectively throughout your day, right? So that, again, that vulnerability idea. What are these factors that make you vulnerable to not being able to manage your emotions? Well, sleeping well would be a good way and a good skill for you to be able to challenge them appropriately and not let them drive your day. And exercise. And you know that's been hard in some circumstances due to the pandemic recently, with gyms being closed. I know that's a very common outlet for many people to use exercise as sort of their go-to coping skill. But, you know, maybe if you were someone who were going to the gym 5, 6 days a week and you can't do that, you know, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as you were doing. The idea here is that you're doing something. So whether that's push-ups, sit-ups, you know, any sort of things that you're doing, squats, anything you want to do, planks, you're doing some sort of physical exercise to get yourself moving. Okay, so that's the please skill. Treat physical illness, eat healthy, avoid mood-altering substances, sleep well, and exercise. Okay, now the last one, pay attention to positive events. Now, this seems super obvious, but it's also probably the hardest skill to use, because people tend to focus on the negative in our lives. Now, that's not a fault of anyone. We all do that. And I would tend to say that it's probably been more difficult recently with recent current events to pay attention to the positives. But it is a really important skill, because what happens is if you tend to look at the negatives, you're surrounding yourself by all that negative emotion. And that if we remember that cycle that I showed you earlier with the wave, you're recreating that cycle. Remember the last one was vulnerability factor? We can go back to it. Okay, so the after effects over here where the vulnerabilities to react can trigger to react again. So what happens is if you're focusing on only the negative in our life, you're re-triggering this cycle over and over and over and over. So it's really harming you and giving you less of a probability that you'd be able to use those emotions effectively, and actually harming you because it's reinforcing all those negative thoughts that you're having, right? So in contrast, remember, opposite action, let's focus on the positive, okay? So this could be something simple like, okay, well, you know, it's another day that I'm working from home, but what's the positive? Wow, I'm so glad I got to see my family before they started their day this morning, because before this happened, we were sort of passing each other and we weren't mindful of each other's experiences, right? So even though there's a negative for you, you've reframed that thinking into something positive and looked at something positive about that situation. Or like I said earlier, maybe you were someone who was motivated to go to the gym, and gyms were closed during the pandemic. So you were unable to go to that gym. So your poor coping skill that wasn't helpful in channeling that frustration, that emotion, might have said, well, if I can't go to the gym, then I'm not going to do anything. Okay, so you're focusing on the negative. But you know what? Let's flip that positive. Let's channel that emotion effectively. If we look at something positive, maybe I can get in some meditation, which is not the same exercise, but is really good for me to get focused. Or maybe I could take advantage of that treadmill that's sitting in the corner of my room that I haven't used, right? So look at some of the positive situations, okay? So if you can add a positive situation, a positive event in your day, that would be fantastic too. And they could be simple. So if it's a closet that you've been putting off organizing, you know, even if you start with one drawer, that's something positive that you did that day. The next day you start with another one. Maybe it's a movie that you wanted to watch that you never got to because you were always so busy. Now you're focusing on that positive event and you're going to tend to something that you wanted to do. So whatever that is for you, I just want you to explore what the positive is within you and within your situation, and think about those small things. Because if we go back to that cycle, when you focus on the positive events and not on the negative events, you're going to channel that emotion cycle in a positive way. You're reinforcing those positive thoughts instead of reinforcing the negative thoughts. Okay? So these are some skills and some ideas that I hope were helpful for you guys tonight. I'm going to end here, excuse me, and leave some time for some questions. Again, if you need more information, you have more questions that I may not have gotten to this evening, please feel free to visit our website. Our contact information is on there. You could reach any of us through the website. Also, like I said earlier, if there's anything else, if you need to talk, if you feel like you need treatment or that these skills have helped you and you want to learn more, please reach out to us. Excuse me. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful. Again, I'm going to leave it open for questions for a little bit. And hopefully you guys got some information out here that can help you in your future. Thank you.